First, I would like to thank Professor Alam for extending this invitation to me and to my colleagues, of course, Dr. Tyra. And as I mentioned before, I so happened by accident that I am here. So I wasn't really prepared for giving the presentation, but I also would like to thank Dr. Tyra. She put some slides for me, and I'm going just to explain and to give you some kind of a brief kind of assessment as of what is really the knowledge-based economy. And I'm going to make this reference to the Arab world. I think we have to be, I think this topic is very important, and this issue of knowledge, of course, is not something new. Now, if you belong to that part of the world, and if you understand even the Islamic heritage, if you read Muhammad al-Ghazali, for example, Muhammad al-Ghazali says that Allah gave Sulaiman a choice among three things: knowledge, power, and money. And he chose knowledge, and as a result of that, he was able to get the other two. So knowledge is a critical factor. Now, those of you who are familiar with Alvin Toffler and his book, Power Shift, he also came to the same conclusion by saying those countries that will have a potential to make progress in the future are those countries that will be in producing knowledge. And he used exactly the same: power, money, and knowledge. And at the end, he came to the conclusion that the progress and the development of any nation in the future, it is basically about protection of knowledge. And he looked at the Japanese and South Korea and many other countries in the world. And that's why knowledge is important. And today, of course, for the developing countries in general, they have, when we speak about knowledge, we have to think about knowledge economy. We really need to think about globalization, because this subject of knowledge, and if you look at the literature written about the knowledge-based economy, it is basically about the last 20 or 30 years. And it was due basically, number one, to globalization, and number two, to advancement in technology, in particular ICT, where knowledge has become an important tool. And these basically technologies are used for the sharing knowledge, using knowledge, and basic. And that's why when it comes to development in general, I'm just trying to think of WASAC. Many people think that the developing countries today, they have a great opportunity in order to be able to develop themselves by having access to knowledge. You see, today you don't need to produce your own knowledge. As a matter of fact, a study by the OECD a few years ago, and they asked the question, why not many countries have been able to develop over the past 50 years or so? And they answered the question themselves by saying that these countries, they adopted our model, and they ended doing research and development, but not innovation. And here were the key words for the knowledge economy. And this is what I wanted to say too, that in our countries, most of our students, they do research and development. And in this research and development simply means you are cycling the information that's already there, but you are not creating anything new of value to the country. And that's why universities in the Arab world today has failed, basically to add value to the total economy in these countries. Most students are not trained very well in order to be able to create knowledge. And there are so many challenges, of course, in the region. And this is a subject, it's rather a big subject, and we can talk a lot about it. So knowledge is important. Now, if we want to understand the knowledge economy, unlike the traditional economy, it's basically driven by ideas, as Dr. Alam was saying. You see, the traditional economy is driven basically by capital and labor. But the new economy is driven by idea, and here where the higher education and universities tend to play a very important role. And I think, and you are all familiar, the World Bank came to the conclusion that the greatest resource of any nation are basically the people of that. So the greatest investment that you can make in any society are basically investment in people. And that's why the knowledge economy requires investment in the human capital, because all these ideas, they don't come from trees or oil or resources. They basically comes from the mind of the people. Now the knowledge economy is a dynamic economy, because every time you generate new ideas, you are creating a new value. And the knowledge economy is about creating wealth. And the knowledge economy is about creating jobs. I think Professor Alam mentioned with regard to the Arab world, and this is one of the greatest challenges facing the Arab countries, is basically unemployment. You see, the World Bank estimate that by 2030, the Arab countries need to create 100 million jobs. The Arab countries today have the highest rate of economic growth. 60% of the total population are less than 20 years old. And this is, of course, will create lots of problems for the future. And that's why the knowledge economy basically is important if we can, let's say, put it into practice. Now, I may not share that much views with the presentation of Professor Alam, who is looking, for example, at the knowledge economy from a global perspective. But we need to have a specific. And if you ask me whether in the Middle East do we have the ingredient for the knowledge economy, excuse me if I say no. We have a long way to go. And in particular, if we want to look at the basic fundamental, the pillars of the knowledge economy. And I'm going to, you see, I don't want to take too much. If you look, for example, look at the Arab economies today. High dependence on resources, mainly oil. You see, in the last 2 years, in particular after the decline in oil prices, there's so much debate and discussion. Now it looks as the decline in oil prices as of being an opener to many, an eye-opener to many of these countries. Now they're thinking of basically converting their economy. They never thought about the 70 or 100 years of the dominance of oil to try to, let's say, convert their economies and to diversify the economic structure to reduce, let's say, the dependency on oil. There's lots of literature on that. And there is also lots of literature stating very clearly that the miseries of the Arab countries today is due to the oil. You see, oil, yes, provided lots of money, but at the same time, the existing structural problems in the Arab world today, it's also because of the oil resources. So they talk about whether oil is a ni'mah or a niqmah. And if you look at the literature, you can clearly see that is more of a ni'mah than a ni'mah to the Arab countries today. So this is a subject that has been widely debated and discussed, and I don't want to take too much time to dwell on it. But those of you interested, you can. As I said, the Arab economies, and this is related to the existing model, because what I wanted basically to come and to say that the existing model, the economic model in the Arab countries did not work for the last 40 or 50 years. So that's why we have to think of an alternative. Many people think that the knowledge economy could be an alternative. But do we really have the knowledge? Or do we understand? How can we create a knowledge economy? That is one of the key issues that need basically to look into. You look at the Arab world, the model of diversification. The manufacturing sector, which has been the key drivers of Western civilization over the past, let's say, 200 years, represent less than 10% of the Arab economies. And this is one of the problems that basically why the Arab countries are not creating enough jobs, and they're not basically being able to, let's say, diversify the economic structures in this. Productivity is very low. It depends how do you measure it. Then the gender issues, and this is another, which simply means that science and technology in the Arab world has not been basically looked into. It's a critical, in particular for the knowledge-based economy. You cannot basically have a knowledge-based economy without investment in science and technology. We are not putting that much emphasis on science and technology. And today, if you look at the data in our universities, for example, we talk about the gender. What is the percentage of women, for example, is going into science and technology? It's very low. Even if you look at the past training and the students' enrollment in science and technology is declining rather than basically increasing. And that's a very bad sign for building capacity for knowledge-based economy. And then the low quality of education. You can name one country that have higher quality education than the Arab countries. You see, and I think one of the reasons for that is basically because the government is still dominant. You see, most of the education in the Arab world is basically a government-driven kind of education. Only recently private education has been basically being given licenses to operate. And you know, when we speak about government, you see, if you read in the literature, you always you come to the conclusion that the least productive people who are those who work for the government. So the government is not really productive. And then, when you look at the income inequalities in the Arab world, and this is a key, because the knowledge economy about equity. You see, you're supposed to be equal. Maybe the 5 or 10% in the Arab world, they control the bulk of the total income. You see? High involvement of the public sector and, of course, indigenous development, which is crucial and critical. So that's what I said, that the model that is currently in place in the Arab countries, it's an important model. And when it comes to development has to be planted from within. I mean, we always teach students. Singapore is a good example for a knowledge-based economy. But can you, let's say, use that model of Singapore to develop your own economy? You can only learn lessons from it. Because indigenous development requires basically looking at your culture, your language, your tradition. All these are important components. And if you want to have, let's say, a knowledge-based development. Now, it has been, the knowledge economy being defined, of course, in the literature in a variety of ways. And that's what we uses, apply, and creates knowledge for human advancement. That's the whole purpose of knowledge creation. It's basically to promote knowledge for development. Now, these are the pillars of the knowledge economy, and this is what the World Bank came to the conclusion that any society that would like basically to build a knowledge-based economy, then the knowledge-based, you need to have a human capital development. And this is where the universities come to play a crucial and critical role. You see, now recently in the United Arab Emirates, they published another very interesting report, what's called Arab Knowledge Report 2014. And the title of that is Localization of Knowledge. And they went into detail to explain exactly how do you basically produce local knowledge for the local environment and for the local development. And this is, I think it is important. Now, I wanted to mention The Economist actually 2 weeks ago. They have a very interesting article about lifelong learning. And I think that could be very interesting to read, because they were linking all this into, let's say, the flexibility in the labor market and the changes, and why universities need to be in a position to have a greater flexibility in order basically to train students for the sake of, let's say, at least serving the demand of the labor market. efficient institution. And when it comes to the, of course, the knowledge-based economy, the institutional structure of the state is crucial. We just said that the public sector may have its own form, but the government also needs to play an important role in building capacity for the knowledge economy. The institution is supposed to finance, supposed to provide all the facilities that is needed. And these could be in the industry, it could be in the university, and it could be in every other aspect of life. So efficient institution or efficiency of the state are important for building a knowledge economy. And then you need to have the innovation. You see, the society that cannot innovate, the society cannot be in a knowledge-based economy. Innovation simply means you are creating a new value. You are adding something to your basically economy by increasing, let's say, the total output of that society. But you need to be innovative and you need to be creative in order to be productive for the sake of, let's say, helping the economy basically to. So innovation comes basically out of these ideas, and ideas comes out of training people in universities. So universities could have a positive impact on, let's say, innovation in different countries. So innovation is important, and then you will have the ICT. And this is a very powerful tool that is used in sharing knowledge, acquiring knowledge, in disseminating knowledge, and in absorbing knowledge. So the ICT infrastructure is crucial and critical. And as I said at the beginning, that many of the developing countries today, they don't need basically to create their own knowledge. You see, the advice is given to these countries, even the Arab countries, why they don't use the existing knowledge. You see, the European, they reach to the plateau. And when they invest in knowledge, they invest in creating new knowledge. But many of the developing countries, they can basically start by using the existing knowledge, and the ICT has become a powerful tool that can provide the access and provide the facilities that these countries need in order to be able, let's say, to create the knowledge for them. So these pillars, and if you look at each one of them, and you look, for example, at the Arab world structure, and whether, do we have enough human capital? You see, we have more brain drain than brain gain. There are more probably engineers working outside the Arab world, or scientists, than in the Arab world. And anybody that you meet in Western countries, and when you ask them, are you going back? I don't want to say the answer. You see, that's one. And when you look at the innovation system, and if you look at the, of course, ICT infrastructure, these are all critical when it comes to knowledge. Now, don't need to go through these, but this knowledge is important for human development. And human development is about education and health. No society will ever be able to make progress today if you don't have the knowledge or the education, and if you don't have the health. So knowledge will help you basically to promote human development, will increase the productivity, and then will basically help you to promote equity in the society. And this is also important. You see, a lot of discrimination. And if you're going basically to discriminate, because you see, it's also important that we need to understand, when it comes to knowledge, knowledge it could be explicit or knowledge it could be tacit. There's so much knowledge basically hidden in the head of the people. So that's why the challenge for many of these countries, how do you explore this knowledge and put it to work for the service of their own societies and their own countries. And if you're not going to give an equal opportunity to people to work, you're not going basically to utilize the knowledge that is needed for development. And then poverty still, you see, we can talk a lot about the Arab world, but here we are basically limiting ourselves to the oil-producing countries, more or less. But there are so many millions of poor people in the Arab world. And unless you're going to solve this, you know, that's why, you know, when you read about globalization, they tell you that if you're not going to solve the poverty, you will never have peace in the world. And the same thing, if you want to provide equity, then you need basically to solve this problem. How much are we integrated in the global economy? You see, we live in this global village where you can have easy access to knowledge, to skills, to resources, to trade, to finance, to investment, but our global integration is still limited. Then higher living standard, and then of course it will help us in women participation. Now, globalization of knowledge, and I only want to make the reference, basically, those of you who are interested, the World Bank World Development Report 1999. The title of that report is basically about knowledge, globalization of knowledge. You see, and that could be a good reference that help us to understand why knowledge is basically, or what they call knowledge for development. So access to knowledge and access to finance and trade, and of course sharing knowledge is becoming important. And then when we look at inclusive sustainable development, this is for Professor Ayam probably, there is a new model now they talk about, an inclusive sustainable development. And the three important basically components of that, the human resource, environmental management, and social. And I recently read a very interesting study. It's basically published by Asian Development Bank. They developed this model, new, what they call it, knowledge-based sustainable development model. This is interesting for anybody who is basically interested to look at. And then we have the institution, of course, the role of the institution is important. You need to fund, you need to provide the facilities, you need to have the money. Of course, you need to change some of your rules, and you need to change basically the laws to build or enhance infrastructure, support research and development. Then private sector participation. And I think this is one of the problems in the Arab world today, that the private sector does not really participate much in the overall development in these countries. So that's why it's crucial that the private sectors, and we're talking, my colleague, Dr. Taher, will maybe give you an idea about what we are really doing at Ahliya University in order to promote entrepreneurship and to try to encourage young people to basically go into business in these things. Then you have a private sector, and then facilitate global access and to support, of course, the agenda when it comes to development. This is basically the role of universities, human capital development, research and development, cooperation and globalization, labor market flexibility, and then you can go basically to lifelong learning. All these are important components of the knowledge economy. Now, I don't want basically to take too long to go into detail, but let me just say that as far as the Arab world, we really have a long way to go when it comes to a knowledge-based economy. We can say all kind of, let's say, you know, we can come with all kind of ideas and policies, but even if you look at the knowledge indicators today, in many of these countries, they are extremely low. And the World Bank, for example, uses mainly, let's say, the share of knowledge export and total export. And if you look at the Arab world today, what will be the percentage of, let's say, knowledge or high-tech export and total export? It's a very variable. So it has a long way to go, and you need basically to restructure the entire, let's say, educational system. You need to diversify the economy. You need to increase basically, let's say, collaboration and cooperation. in particular with Western universities, and you need to have access basically to the knowledge of the rest of the world in order to be able to help you in terms of, let's say, meeting some of these issues related to knowledge economy. And thank you very much.
Please remember, if we all help and do a little bit, it will make a big difference